Hello, welcome to the Columbia Daily Tribune's Behind the Stripes webcast. This is sports editor Joe Walljasper alongside Tribune football beat writer Dave Matter. Dave, we're in week 3 of preseason practice. Just who has caught your eye? Maybe who you think has raised their stock in the preseason?
Well, you look at positions where they've had injuries, and they've had so many that some guys have had to come in off the bench, and I think they've at least established themselves as guys who will play a lot during the season, maybe not start once they get fully healthy, if they get fully healthy. But you look at receivers like Brandon Giroux, a local kid from Rockbridge who was a walk-on. He went on scholarship, went back to walk-on status. Now he's on scholarship again, and I think he's really earned it because he may not start this year, but he is right now because Jarrell Jackson is out with a hamstring injury. So I think he's solidified himself as part of that receiver rotation. Marcus Lucas has too. He's a second-year guy, played a little bit as a true freshman last year, caught 3 passes. But I think he's solidly a part of the mix there at receiver also. Look at the offensive line. They've had a bunch of injuries there. Jack Miners seems to be a guy that's kind of taking advantage of that because, for one, he's really versatile. He can play both guard positions. He's played right tackle. They feel like they can plug him in anywhere and don't lose a whole lot. I think eventually they expect Travis Ruth, their center, to be back, and that kind of shuffles things around. But Miners is a guy they can bring in and pretty much treat like a starter because he's that good. Then I think you look at defensive line. Both defensive ends have been injured, Jacquez Smith and Brad Madison, so they've looked to the bench. And Michael Sam is a guy who played a lot last year, but I think he's another guy where they could almost count on him to play starters minutes, starters reps, because he's played pretty well in camp and played pretty well last year. And another one is Braden Burnett, just another defensive end on this team that if they need to, I think they can plug him in there and he can get the job done as a pass rusher. And then you look in the secondary, a guy that's really helped himself is Trey Hopson. He's the only senior among the cornerbacks. And I think if the season started right now, he'd probably be starting at one of those positions because he's had such a good camp. And they just really like his attitude, his leadership, and everything he's doing back there. So even if he doesn't start eventually, when the season begins, I think he's that first guy off the bench and will play a lot.
One guy I would mention that came in as a starter, so I don't know how much you can improve your stock, but after the first practice, Gary Pinkel said he would like one of the running backs to kind of pull away from the pack, and I think Kendall Lawrence has done that. Like when you give him a hole, he can take it the distance. He's of the bunch of them, I think he's looked the best by a pretty good margin.
He's really explosive when he finds a crease, and that's kind of the thing that the other guys don't necessarily have. I mean, Devin Moore's a good tailback, but he's not going to run away from you, and Lawrence really has. I mean, he has 3 60-yard runs in scrimmages. So for one, that says something about that number 2 defense. They're allowing that, but I think he's just really kind of distanced himself from the others. And I don't know if that means he gets 15, 20 carries, but I think he does get the bulk of the carries once the season begins.
Now, in defense, one area that was kind of the mystery of the whole defense was the defensive backfield. They lost 3 starters from last year. How do you think that area has been looking, and maybe who do you think the players are going to be in the rotation there?
Well, the safety position has really been hit with injuries. Kenja Jackson's been out with the hamstring, and they expect him back, but that's one of those things that can kind of linger for a while. At free safety, Tavon Bolden was their best guy coming out of spring practices, won the award for most improved safety. He's been working with the 3rd team all camp, listed 3rd. No one will come out and flatly say it, but it's pretty obvious he's serving some kind of disciplinary action because he hasn't played at all with the 1st or 2nd unit. But I think gradually, if he works his way back in the good graces, he's going to be a starter or at least play a lot. But the guy right now that would be the number 1 free safety is Matt White, and he's out with an ankle injury right now. So they're dealing with some adversity there. Kenronte Walker is a guy I think will play a lot anyway, but may have to start if these injuries persist. And then another one's Braylon Webb, a 2nd-year guy, redshirted last year. They like him as a free safety too, so they've kind of got some issues there. And then at corner, we mentioned Trey Hopson. He's had a great camp. E.J. Gaines is another guy that Gary Pinkel has called possibly the most talented cornerback they've recruited at Missouri. I do think they want to see a little bit more effort and consistency from him, and maybe they're sending a little bit of a message by bumping him down to the 2nd team. And then you got Kip Edwards on the other side, who's really experienced, and I think is poised to have a pretty good year.
All right, you mentioned a lot of these injuries. Other than the Elvis Fisher injury, which is going to be a season ender, are we looking at pretty serious? I mean, how risky is it that these guys will not be ready to play for the season opener?
We'll know a lot more this week at practice, but Travis Ruth, the projected starting center, has a strained Achilles, and he's been in a boot for about a week and a half now. So I don't know if that's really serious, but it's not good because he's a guy that needed a lot of practice reps. He's the only new starter on this line, and he hasn't practiced at all in the last week and a half. So that's somebody to keep an eye on. Brad Madison's had a shoulder injury. They say he can play through it. He doesn't necessarily need surgery. But that's another thing. I mean, he was such a good player last year. They have such high expectations for him. It'll be interesting to see if they have to hold him back a little bit early on in the year because of that. And the other defensive end, Jacque Smith, has a strained big toe. That could be pretty painful, I imagine. And, he's a guy they're counting on a lot this year, so they might have to ease him back a little bit. And then the other injuries are some hamstrings that just need some time. Jarrell Jackson, Kenja Jackson, and also Will Ebner, linebacker, has a concussion. And we know how scary those can be, so I think they'll monitor that pretty closely. And I think he's had a few in the past. And he's a guy that, he plays so physical and he's such an explosive hitter. They really have to monitor him closely.
All right, and then lastly, we've had a couple scrimmages to look at James Franklin. Just your thoughts on if he is starting to look to you like maybe the next logical guy to follow in the footsteps of the previous three, if you see him like as a 3-year starter who's going to be the next great quarterback, or is he someone that's just sort of, he maybe is the guy for now, but he's someone that could get beat out down the line?
It's hard to say without seeing what he can do in a game, setting. In the scrimmages, I think he looked fine. I think he's clearly more poised, and he seems to make fewer mistakes than the guys behind him. And that's half the battle of being a starting quarterback. I mean, can he make big plays? We haven't seen a lot of that in the scrimmages, but he does seem to manage things pretty well. He's not throwing a lot of really costly passes that can lead to interceptions. So in that regard, I think he's been okay, but it'll be interesting to see how he plays this year, how he meshes with his receivers. This year, I'm not going to say he has it easy, but he's got so much experience around him. In 2012, it's a lot different because he's losing all the tailbacks, losing a lot of experience up front, losing some really good veteran receivers. So, does he have what it takes to be a franchise guy? I don't think we know that answer yet, and they'll have some options in the future. Corbin Burke-Stresser has looked good at times, freshman quarterback in camp. I don't think he's ready to quite, be that guy quite yet. And then Matty Mock, of course, is is a high school senior who's committed to Missouri. Will be here next year. Could things open up if Franklin has a shaky year? Yeah, absolutely, I think so. But if they plug him in like these last couple quarterbacks they've had, and he produces at a similar level, then I think you can count on him being the guy. But you just can't take it for granted. As much success as Gary Pinkel and David Joseph have had with quarterbacks, he still has to produce.
It is hard to even tell from scrimmages because even when Chase Daniel was here, he wouldn't look that great in a scrimmage because the defense is so well versed on what you're running as an offense that they always look better, I think. And when James was in the games last year, I thought he looked pretty good. He completed a high percentage of his passes and ran the ball pretty well. So I would give him the benefit of the doubt until he gets out there and somehow proves otherwise. But I do think his health is a pretty major concern as you look at the cast of guys who might be the backups. And I just wonder if somehow that might sort of affect how much they want to run him and kind of how they manage him, because it looks like it could be a pretty scary situation if he were to get hurt this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is kind of the wild card with him, is how they use him as a runner. He can be a really physical guy in the running game. He's a big kid, and he'll take on tacklers. And we just haven't seen him in the scrimmages yet be a factor in the running game because it's just the nature of scrimmages. They whistle the play dead. They don't want anybody touching him. Nobody thought watching scrimmages when Brad Smith was a redshirt freshman that he would be much of a runner. And turns out he was the most prolific running quarterback ever. So that's something yet that haven't quite seen and won't until that opener.
All right, well, thanks for joining us again. Next week we will preview the season opener against Miami of Ohio.